The shovel struck something that wasn't dirt. In the lamplight filtering through October fog, young Ezra Blackwood saw the glint of tarnished brass. A button, maybe, or buckle from clothes that had rotted away decades ago. His bride-to-be, Mercy Whitten, stood 3 feet back, her wedding dress already stained with grave soil. Between them lay the thing they'd both been told never to disturb. The reason their families had hated each other for 4 generations while forcing this same midnight ceremony upon their children. The preacher's voice wavered as he spoke the binding words, but Ezra barely heard him. Something was moving beneath the loose earth. Not the settling of old bones. This was deliberate, purposeful, like fingers testing the weight of soil above them. Mercy's breath came in short gasps, her bouquet of mountain laurel trembling in her hands. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a binding spell disguised as holy matrimony, and both families knew it. The question neither dared ask was simple. What happens when the ritual finally fails? The Cumberland Mountains of eastern Kentucky held secrets in every hollow, but none darker than the one that split Blackwood and Whitten blood for 97 years. In the autumn of 1978, the latest generation prepared to pay their family's ancient debt with marriage and midnight vows beside a grave that bore no name. Ezra Blackwood had known since childhood that he would marry Mercy Whitten on his 21st birthday. Not because of love, though he'd grown fond of her quick wit and defiant streak during their supervised visits, but because his grandfather's grandfather had made a promise that bound every generation after him. The Blackwoods lived on the north face of Pine Mountain, where the morning sun never quite burned off the fog that clung to their tobacco fields. 3 generations of men had worked the same rocky soil, each dying young from accidents that seemed to follow a pattern. Falls from barn lofts, drownings in shallow creeks, heart attacks that struck healthy men in their prime. The Whittens held the south slope, where their corn grew tall despite soil that should have been too thin for good yields. They prospered in ways that made their neighbors whisper about devil's bargains and unnatural luck. But prosperity came with its own curse. Their women rarely lived to see their 40th year, claimed by fevers that no doctor could explain or cancers that spread too fast for medical understanding. Both families attended the same white clapboard church in Harlan, sitting on opposite sides of the aisle, never speaking except when necessity demanded it. Their children played separately, learned separately, lived in the shadow of a hatred so old that most had forgotten its origin. But the elders remembered enough to keep the ritual alive. Every 25 years, when the eldest children of each family reached maturity, they would meet at midnight in the graveyard behind Sunset Baptist Church. There, beside a particular grave that had never been marked with stone or cross, they would be married by whichever preacher could be convinced to perform the ceremony, usually with a generous donation to the church building fund and careful omission of certain details about the location and timing. Mercy Whitten had tried to run away twice. The first time, at 17, she'd made it as far as Lexington before her Uncle Silas found her working in a diner and brought her home with promises that turned to threats during the 4-hour drive through winding mountain roads. The second attempt, just last year, had ended before it began when her grandmother showed her the family ledger, a leather-bound book that recorded every Whitten death since 1881. "Read the pattern, girl," her grandmother had said, pointing to entries written in fading ink. "See what happens when we don't keep our promises." The ledger told a story of women who aged rapidly after bearing children, men who died in accidents that clustered around the times when marriages should have taken place but didn't. 2 entries stood out: 1929 and 1954. Years when no ceremony had been performed. In both cases, an entire generation had died within months, some in the mine collapse of 30, others in the flash flood that swept away 6 Witten houses in 55. Mercy understood the mathematics of survival. Marry Ezra Blackwood, bear children, hope to live long enough to see them grow. Refuse and watch her family disappear like morning mist. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Ezra, meanwhile, had accepted his fate with the resignation of a man condemned. He'd finished high school, spent 2 years helping his father with the farm, and tried not to think about how his own grandfather had died at 34, crushed beneath a tractor that had never given trouble before. The Blackwood men understood their role. Marry young, father children, die before their sons had to watch them grow old and bitter. What neither Ezra nor Mercy understood was why their family's hatred ran so deep, or why the midnight ceremonies always took place beside the same unmarked grave in ground that had been consecrated as a churchyard only 50 years ago. The patch of earth was older than Sunset Baptist, older than the memories of the oldest residents. Local folklore claimed it had been a Cherokee burial ground, but the Cherokee had been driven out in the 1830s, and their burial practices didn't match the stories that survived. 3 weeks before the wedding, Ezra's grandfather pulled him aside after Sunday service. Josiah Blackwood was 73, the oldest living member of either family, a fact that marked him as either blessed or cursed, depending on who you asked. His survival past the age when most Blackwood men died had given him a reputation for wisdom, though his neighbors also whispered that he'd made his own dark bargains to reach old age. "Boy, there's things about this marriage you need to know," Josiah said as they walked between the weathered headstones toward the family plot. "Not the Bible verses about love and honor, the real reasons we keep doing this." He stopped beside a grave marked only with field stones arranged in a rough circle. The grass grew differently here, lusher and darker than the surrounding cemetery, fed by something more than rain and mountain soil. "Your great-great-grandfather, Caleb Blackwood, he was the one who started this," Josiah continued. "Back in 1881, he found something in these mountains that wasn't meant to be found, something that should have stayed buried." Ezra had heard fragments of this story before, but never from someone who spoke as if they'd been present when it happened. Josiah's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, the tone of a man recounting personal experience rather than family legend. "Caleb thought he could use it," Josiah said. "Thought he could control what he dug up and make it work for him instead of against him. He made a deal with Jeremiah Witten. They'd share the burden, split the cost between their bloodlines. Neither family would have to bear it alone." The old man's hands shook as he pointed toward the unmarked grave. "But some things can't be controlled, only contained. And containment requires sacrifice. Every generation, we pay the price to keep it sleeping. The marriage ain't about love or unity. It's about binding the families together so the burden stays shared." A cold wind moved through the cemetery, carrying the scent of something that wasn't quite earth, wasn't quite decay. Ezra felt his stomach turn as the implications settled over him like fog rolling down the mountainside. Reverend James Morrison had performed 3 midnight weddings in his 15 years at Sunset Baptist Church, and each had left him questioning both his faith and his sanity. The first, in 1965, had been explained as a romantic elopement between feuding families, Mountain Romeo and Juliet, he'd been told. The generous donation to the church roof fund had helped him overlook the unusual timing and location. By 1973, when he'd married Ezra's cousin to a Witten girl, the explanations had worn thin. There was nothing romantic about standing in a graveyard at midnight, while both families watched from the shadows, their faces grim with obligation rather than joy. The bride had been pale and silent throughout the ceremony, the groom barely old enough to legally marry. Morrison had begun keeping a private journal after that night, documenting details that troubled his sleep. Now, approaching his third midnight ceremony, Morrison had started researching the history of his own church. What he'd discovered in the county records didn't match the stories he'd been told. Sunset Baptist had been built in 1928, but the cemetery was much older. The land had been donated by joint deed from both the Blackwood and Whitten families, with specific clauses requiring that certain burial sites remain undisturbed and that the church maintain perpetual access for necessary observances. The county clerk, a woman whose own family had lived in Harlan for 6 generations, had been reluctant to show him the full deed. When he pressed, she'd finally admitted that there were oral covenants attached to the written agreement, promises that weren't legally binding but carried weight in mountain communities where a man's word still meant something. Some traditions, she'd said carefully, are older than the law, and some promises are kept because breaking them costs more than keeping them. Morrison had tried to involve his denominational superiors, but his carefully worded letters about irregular ceremonies with questionable theological foundations had received form responses about pastoral flexibility and community sensitivity. The annual donation from the Blackwood and Whitten families kept the church solvent, paid for repairs and improvements that small mountain congregations couldn't usually afford. He was trapped by his own complicity, bound to perform ceremonies that violated every principle of Christian marriage while ensuring his church's survival. In the basement of the Harlan County Courthouse, dusty filing cabinets held records that painted a picture of unnatural prosperity and calculated death stretching back nearly a century. Property transfers, death certificates, mining permits, and tax records told a story that no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone seemed to understand. The Whittens had owned mineral rights that should have belonged to larger mining companies. Their land had produced coal seams that geological surveys insisted couldn't exist. Their crops grew in soil that agricultural extension agents described as unsuitable for cultivation in official reports, while privately noting yields that defied scientific explanation. The Blackwoods had avoided the mining accidents that claimed hundreds of lives in surrounding communities. Their sons died young, but rarely in mine collapses or equipment failures that killed their neighbors. Instead, they succumbed to accidents that seemed almost surgical in their precision, falling from exactly the right height to break their necks, drowning in creek beds where the water was barely knee-deep. Death certificates from 1929 revealed a pattern that should have triggered investigation, but somehow never did. 8 Whittens and 6 Blackwoods had died between January and October of that year, all from different causes, but all occurring in the months after a missed marriage ceremony. The deaths had stopped abruptly in November, the same month that a hasty wedding had been performed between cousins rather than the traditional eldest children. County records showed similar clusters in 1954, when both families had lost members to a combination of accidents, sudden illnesses, and disappearances. Again, the deaths had stopped only after an emergency ceremony had been performed in December of that year. What the records didn't show, but what local oral histories preserved, was the behavior of wildlife during these periods. Animals had fled the mountains around both family properties. Livestock had died mysteriously. Wells had run dry, then resumed flowing without explanation after the marriages took place. Abel Cunningham ran the general store in Harlan, the same business his father and grandfather had operated before him. At 68, he was old enough to remember the stories, but young enough to have witnessed the strange prosperity that marked both the Blackwood and Whitten families. His store had extended credit to both clans during lean seasons, knowing the debt would be paid when their seemingly impossible harvests came in. He'd also sold them supplies that raised questions no one wanted to ask. Silver chains and locks, always purchased separately by different family members. Blessed candles from the Catholic Church in Barberville, odd for families who attended Baptist services. Rock salt in quantities that made no sense for preserving meat, especially when ordered every October regardless of hunting success. The most unsettling purchases had been fabric and thread in specific colors. White for the brides, black for the mourning clothes that both families ordered in advance of each ceremony. As if they knew exactly who would need burial shrouds in the months following the wedding. Abel's father had told him about the first ceremony he'd witnessed in 1934, when he'd been 17 and working his first job loading supplies for the families. He'd been curious enough to follow the wedding party to the cemetery, hiding behind a mausoleum to watch the midnight proceedings. "The ground moved, son," his father had whispered years later, when Abel was old enough to understand. Not from wind or settling. Something underneath was restless. And when they said their vows, when they kissed to seal the marriage, the movement stopped. Like whatever was down there had gone back to sleep. Abel had inherited more than a business from his father. He'd inherited the knowledge that some customers required absolute discretion, that certain transactions were never to be discussed, and that the prosperity of both families somehow ensured the stability of the entire community. Dr. Sarah Chen had moved to Harlan in 1975, fresh from her residency at the University of Kentucky Medical Center. She'd expected to treat black lung disease, mining injuries, and the usual ailments of rural Appalachia. What she hadn't expected was the pattern of deaths that seemed to follow genetic lines with almost mathematical precision. Her first encounter with the Blackwood family curse had been treating Ezra's father for a broken leg in 1976. Thomas Blackwood was 32, healthy and strong, but the X-rays had shown bone density patterns that troubled her. His skeleton looked like that of a much older man, as if his body was aging rapidly from within. When she'd mentioned this observation to older colleagues, they'd warned her away from asking too many questions about either the Blackwoods or the Whittons. "Mountain families have their own ways," one doctor had said. "Best to treat what's in front of you and leave the rest alone." But Dr. Chen's medical training made her curious about patterns, and the patterns she observed defied rational explanation. Blood samples from both families showed unusual mineral compositions, trace elements that weren't found in typical Appalachian soil or water. The women aged rapidly after childbirth, showing cellular damage that resembled exposure to radiation or toxic chemicals. The men developed a distinctive form of anemia that seemed linked to shortened lifespans rather than nutritional deficiencies. Most disturbing were the birth records. Children from the midnight marriages showed abnormal development patterns. Not birth defects exactly, but accelerated growth that seemed to prepare them for roles they'd have to fill much earlier than normal families would require. What would you do if you discovered that an entire medical mystery was being perpetuated by community silence? Would you investigate further, or accept that some knowledge comes with a price too high to pay? Sheriff Dale Morton had held office in Harlan County for 12 years, long enough to learn which questions not to ask and which reports to file carefully away. He'd investigated 7 deaths involving members of the Blackwood and Whitten families, and each investigation had ended with conclusions that satisfied no one but couldn't be challenged with available evidence. His predecessor, Sheriff William Hayes, had left behind files that weren't part of the official record. In a locked cabinet in Morton's office sat 3 folders containing witness statements that had never been submitted to the state police. Photographs that showed evidence inconsistent with official reports. and handwritten notes documenting strange phenomena that occurred around the time of each midnight marriage ceremony. One file contained reports from the 1965 wedding. Multiple witnesses had described sounds coming from beneath the cemetery, not the settling of coffins or natural underground water movement, but rhythmic percussion like muffled drum beats. 2 deputies had resigned their positions, rather than continue investigating anomalies that had no rational explanation. Another file documented the 1973 ceremony, when electromagnetic disturbances had interfered with radio communications throughout the county for 3 hours surrounding the midnight hour. Power lines had flickered in patterns that utility company engineers couldn't explain. Livestock had behaved erratically for days afterward. Morton understood that his job wasn't to solve the mystery of the feuding families. His job was to maintain order in a community where certain traditions ensured stability. Both families paid their taxes, committed no crimes that couldn't be overlooked, and contributed to the economic foundation that kept Harlan County functional during the decline of coal mining. But maintaining order required accepting responsibility for covering up evidence that state investigators might not understand. Morton had learned to write reports that technically told the truth, while omitting details that would prompt uncomfortable questions from outsiders. Silence. 2 days before the wedding, Mercy's grandmother finally showed her the complete ledger. Not just the death records, but the accounting that preceded and followed each ceremony. The leather-bound book contained more than family history. It held a precise calculation of cost and benefit, stretching back 4 generations. Each midnight marriage had been followed by specific improvements in family fortune. Mineral discoveries, land purchases, successful harvests, insurance settlements that came at exactly the right time. But the prosperity wasn't random. It was proportional to the sacrifice made during the ceremony. The more the families suffered afterward, the greater their material gains became. The arrangement requires balance, her grandmother explained, turning pages that documented a century of careful bookkeeping. We give it blood and binding, it gives us survival and success, but the price keeps rising. The ledger showed that early ceremonies had required only the marriage itself. By the 1920s, the families had needed to add blood sacrifices, small cuts made during the ceremony, drops spilled on the grave. By the 50s, the ritual had expanded to include burial of personal items belonging to the bride and groom, symbolically offering pieces of their lives to whatever lay beneath the earth. Now, approaching the end of the 20th century, the arrangement demanded more. The current generation would need to spend their entire wedding night in the cemetery, maintaining vigil until dawn to ensure the binding held. Previous couples had been allowed to leave after the ceremony. Ezra and Mercy would become the first to offer themselves as continuous guardians. What happens if we refuse? Mercy asked, though she already knew the answer. Her grandmother turned to the final pages, where recent entries were written in her own hand. Names of children born to midnight marriages, their birth dates and projected lifespans calculated with actuarial precision. Ezra and Mercy's future children were already listed, their potential names recorded alongside estimated death dates that assumed the ritual would continue into the next generation. Refusal means the end of both bloodlines, her grandmother said simply, and the beginning of something much worse. The night before the ceremony, Josiah Blackwood took Ezra to a place that few living people had seen. Hidden beneath an outcropping of limestone on the boundary between family properties was an entrance that had been sealed with concrete and rebar in 1955. Using a crowbar and sledgehammer, the old man broke through the barrier he'd helped install 23 years earlier. The tunnel beyond stretched deep into the mountain, carved from solid rock by tools that had left marks inconsistent with Cherokee craftsmanship or 19th century mining equipment. The walls showed evidence of construction techniques that seemed far older than any known settlement in the region. Patterns that suggested mathematical precision rather than manual labor. Your great-great-grandfather found this in 1879, Josiah explained, his flashlight beam revealing chambers that branched off from the main passage. Caleb thought it was Cherokee work at first, thought he'd discovered burial chambers that might contain valuable artifacts. The tunnel led to a central chamber dominated by a stone platform that had clearly been designed for specific purposes. Channels cut into the rock led from the platform to smaller alcoves where artifacts still remained. Metal objects that hadn't corroded despite decades of underground humidity. Carved symbols that matched no known written language, and what appeared to be mechanical devices constructed from materials that didn't match known metallurgy. What he found wasn't Cherokee, Josiah continued. Wasn't made by any people who've lived in these mountains. But it was alive, and it was hungry, and it offered him a bargain he couldn't refuse. The platform showed stains that could have been blood, rust, or some combination of both. The stone around these stains had been worn smooth, as if generations of people had placed their hands in exactly the same positions during ceremonies that followed patterns older than European settlement. Ezra understood now why the cemetery grave remained unmarked. It wasn't the burial site, it was the entrance. The midnight marriages weren't performed beside a tomb, but over a doorway that needed to be sealed with human commitment and blood sacrifice. On the morning of October 31st, Reverend Morrison received a package that had been left on the church steps sometime during the night. Inside was a Bible that had belonged to the previous minister, the one who'd performed the first midnight ceremony in 1949. Between its pages were handwritten notes that revealed the true nature of what Morrison had been facilitating. The previous minister, Reverend Samuel Potter, had documented his growing understanding of the ceremonies through careful biblical research and personal observation. His notes revealed that the midnight marriages weren't Christian services at all, but elaborate deception designed to give supernatural binding the appearance of Holy Sacrament. Potter had identified the specific biblical passages that were always included in the ceremony, not because they sanctified the marriage, but because they contained binding language that worked in conjunction with much older ritual elements. The wedding vows weren't about love and commitment between the couple. They were about accepting responsibility for maintaining an ancient containment system. Most damning was Potter's final entry, dated just 1 week before his sudden death from heart failure in 1972. I understand now that I am not performing marriages. I am conducting a sacrifice disguised as a sacrament. The families are offering their children to maintain a bargain that should have been broken generations ago. God help me. I don't know how to stop it. Morrison realized that he had become part of a conspiracy that stretched far beyond mountain feuds or family traditions. He was facilitating a form of human sacrifice that used Christian ritual as camouflage, binding young people to a fate they couldn't understand or escape. But backing out now would leave Ezra and Mercy without anyone willing to perform the ceremony, and the consequences of a missed ritual would affect more than just the two families involved. As midnight approached on October 31st, both families gathered in the cemetery with a sense of finality that hadn't marked previous ceremonies. This would be the last midnight marriage, they'd all been told, because the arrangement was changing. The entity beneath the mountain had grown strong enough to demand a more permanent solution. Ezra stood beside the unmarked grave in his grandfather's wedding suit, altered to fit his smaller frame. Mercy wore a dress that had been made specifically for this ceremony. white silk that would be buried with her if the ritual went wrong. Both carried bouquets made from mountain laurel and poisonous oleander, flowers that would bloom regardless of season, sustained by soil that fed on more than rain and sunlight. Reverend Morrison began the service with words that sounded like traditional wedding vows, but carried meanings that predated Christianity by centuries. As he spoke, both families began chanting responses in a language that wasn't English, wasn't Cherokee, wasn't anything that belonged to the known history of Appalachia. The ground beneath their feet began to warm, as if heated by fires far below. The unmarked grave started to glow with phosphorescence that seemed to rise from deep underground chambers. And slowly, inevitably, the earth began to crack. What emerged wasn't exactly alive, but it wasn't dead either. It was patient, intelligent, and hungry for the binding that would give it permanent access to the surface world. The midnight marriages had been feeding it gradually, generation by generation, strengthening it until it could make new demands. The choice facing Ezra and Mercy wasn't about love or family duty anymore. It was about whether they would become the final sacrifice that completed a transformation nearly a century in the making, or whether they would find the strength to break a cycle that had already claimed 4 generations of their bloodlines. The answer lay in understanding what their ancestors had never realized. Some bargains can't be fulfilled, only ended. As the entity began to emerge from beneath the cemetery, Ezra made a choice that none of his ancestors had been strong enough to make. Instead of accepting the wedding rings that would seal their fate, he grabbed Mercy's hand and ran toward the old tunnel entrance that his grandfather had shown him the night before. The gathered families shouted warnings, threats, and pleas, but Ezra understood now that their welfare had never been the real concern. They had been accomplices in a multi-generational conspiracy designed to strengthen something that should have remained buried. Their prosperity had come at the cost of sacrificing their own children to maintain an arrangement that benefited the entity more than the families. In the underground chamber, Ezra and Mercy found the tools they needed: explosive charges left behind by Caleb Blackwood's original mining operation, preserved in the dry air for nearly a century. They also found something else: carved instructions left by previous generations who had tried and failed to break the binding. The symbols on the chamber walls weren't random decoration. They were a containment system designed by people who had understood the entity's nature better than the families who inherited their burden. The midnight marriages hadn't been feeding the creature. They'd been gradually weakening the original bindings that kept it imprisoned. Working together, Ezra and Mercy followed the carved instructions to reset the containment. It required blood, but not submission. It required binding, but not marriage. It required sacrifice, but not of their futures or their children's lives. As they completed the ancient ritual properly, the mountain shook with the entity's rage. Above them, in the cemetery, both families felt the ground heave as the creature was forced back into deeper chambers that had been designed to hold it permanently. The phosphorescent glow faded, the warm earth cooled, and the cracks in the ground sealed themselves. When Ezra and Mercy emerged from the tunnel at dawn, they found both families waiting in stunned silence. The prosperity that had marked their bloodlines for 4 generations had ended abruptly, but so had the curse that claimed their children. The Blackwoods and Whittons remained in eastern Kentucky, but their relationship to the land and each other changed permanently. Without the supernatural assistance they'd enjoyed for nearly a century, both families had to learn how to survive through conventional farming, honest work, and mutual cooperation instead of ancient bargains. Ezra and Mercy married 6 months later in a traditional church ceremony, not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. Their wedding took place at noon on a Sunday in April, surrounded by flowers that grew naturally in mountain soil that no longer glowed with unnatural phosphorescence. The tunnel entrance was sealed permanently with concrete and steel, then hidden beneath a rock slide that appeared to be natural, but was carefully engineered by both families working together. The cemetery above returned to normal use, though the unmarked grave remained visible as a reminder of what lay beneath. Reverend Morrison left Sunset Baptist Church, but not before destroying the records that documented the midnight ceremonies. His replacement was told only that the Blackwood-Witten feud had ended through marriage, and that both families had become model members of the congregation. Dr. Chen continued practicing medicine in Harlan County, but noticed that her patients from both families began showing normal lifespans and health patterns. The mysterious anemia and accelerated aging that had plagued previous generations disappeared as completely as if they had never existed. Sheriff Morton retired early, taking with him the unofficial files that documented decades of covered-up evidence. His successor inherited a county where the most notable crimes were standard rural offenses rather than inexplicable phenomena that required careful non-investigation. The children born to Ezra and Mercy grew up hearing stories about the old feud, but as family history rather than binding obligation. They learned that sometimes the strongest choice is refusing to honor the commitments that previous generations made without understanding their true cost. Today, the mountains of eastern Kentucky hold no more secrets than any other rural region where coal mining gave way to tourism and small farms struggled to survive in a changing economy. The Blackwood and Witten families still live on opposite slopes of Pine Mountain, but their children attend the same schools, work in the same businesses, and sometimes marry for love rather than obligation. But hikers who venture too far into the backcountry sometimes report strange phenomena around the old family properties. Warm spots in the ground that persist through winter, vegetation that grows in patterns that suggest intelligent design, and sounds from underground that could be wind through limestone caves or something altogether different. The sealed tunnel remains hidden beneath its artificial rock slide, protected by posted signs warning of unstable geology and dangerous conditions. Local residents respect these warnings, understanding that some boundaries exist for reasons that don't require explanation to be valid. In the basement of the Harlan County Historical Society, a single ledger documents the economic and social impact of the Blackwood-Witten feud, its surprising resolution, and the prosperity that both families eventually found through cooperation rather than supernatural assistance. What the ledger doesn't mention, but what older residents still whisper about, is the way the mountains themselves seem to sigh with relief when the midnight marriages finally ended. Sometimes they say, the land itself knows when an ancient wrong has been made right, and the earth settles more peacefully when certain debts are finally paid in full. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.